You are certainly welcome to. So I want to welcome everyone officially to the Stockbridge Library, Museum, and Archives online poetry series entitled Medicine for the Soul. This was the brilliant idea of the president of our board, John Gillespie, who's with us here today. And we thought we would have 1 month of poetry readings during the height of the lockdown of the pandemic last April. And here we are, the following April, still going strong. So the program has really taken on a life of its own, and we've been very lucky to have a variety of talented poets, and today is no exception. Today we have with us Erica Charis-Molling, and she is joining us today from Boston, where she works as the education director for Mass Poetry and also a managing editor for the Los Angeles Review. Erica's work has been published in literary journals such as Tinderbox, Redivider, Presence, Crosswinds, Glass, Anchor, Vinyl, Entropy, and others. And her poems have been nominated for a Pushcart Prize and the Orison Anthology. She received her MFA in creative writing from Antioch University, and I would just personally like to throw in there that she has also worked as a librarian for the Boston Public Library and an outreach librarian for the Berklee College of Music. Erica, thank you for joining us today. And John, I'll turn the program over to you and Erica.
Wendy, thank you very much for the introduction. And Erica, thank you for reading today. So we start each week spending some time with you to understand your creative process. So 2020 and even 2021, there were some, amazing themes. Obviously the pandemic, racial injustice, income inequality, the whole political, I don't know. I'm so glad I'm not on Twitter. I'm not looking at Twitter every 10 seconds. I'm probably looking at my text, but not Twitter. No, and then what happened at the Capitol January 6th, and just, the Georgia voting rights changes, and I don't know. It just seems like there's about 2 hours of a slow news cycle, and then something drops to earth like a 2-ton weight. So have some of those themes started to work their way, show up in your work?
I would say little pieces. So, the things that are going on around me inevitably will show up in my writing, big and small. But I've only got little lines or little phrases so far. And that's pretty standard for me. I tend to metabolize things, personal events, political events, slowly. So often it will take me at least a year, if not a couple of years, to sort of work through what that experience means to me and what it's attached to in the world outside. So yeah, it's starting to happen just a little bit now, but it's been slow, and I think to me that's okay. News is supposed to be fast, and sometimes poetry is fast, but to me, poetry has always been a slower, more meditative process than responding to in the moment events. So it makes sense to me that it would be coming along a little slower, but okay. Eventually it'll come in there, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't think it's all of a sudden change everyone's creative direction. We're just trying to understand, and I don't know, the themes were very dramatic, maybe more dramatic than in prior years. So we're just trying to figure out, how does that, does it weigh on you? I think you're right. It has to marinate and get digested before it can come out in a different way.
Yeah.
So how does a poem get triggered or start for you?
Well, to me, I think there are kind of two things. I think of poetry as a conversation. either a conversation with other poets or a conversation with the world around me. And so often poems are a response to something or someone. So sometimes a poem will start after I've read another poem, and I feel compelled to respond to that poet or feel inspired by something that they spoke about in their poem that inspires me to write about something that I've experienced or seen. So sometimes that's the conversation. Sometimes it's a conversation with the outside world, and that's been a little harder to come by lately. But little fragments of language overheard or seen on a sign. I'll read a poem later on today that was inspired by a sign at Yosemite. And those things tend to start an internal dialogue that will start to germinate into a line or a phrase that I'll then build into a poem. And, it's taken me a long time. I've written poems. My mother has the first poem I ever wrote saved, and it's from the second grade. It's a poem about a turkey, Thanksgiving poem about the turkey called Helter Skelter, Run for Shelter. I was very concerned about the turkeys. So I've been writing poems for a long time, but it hasn't been until the last few years that I've really started to understand my own process. It was really sort of mysterious to me where these poems came from and when they would show up or when they wouldn't show up. And it's only been in the last few years that I feel like I'm starting to understand the way my process works. And a lot of it has to do with my subconscious, honestly, and giving my subconscious room to start to build something before I'm actually aware of it. So one of the things that I will do is I will take some snippet of something, and I couldn't tell you what the instinct is that tells me that that snippet is going to be a poem, but something that I'll respond to. And I'll set it aside in the evening. I'll look at it. I'll think about it a little bit, look at it some more, and then I'll go to bed. And first thing in the morning, before I do anything else, 5:30 in the morning, get a glass of water, stumble down to my computer, and I'll write for an hour, starting with whatever I set aside for myself the night before. And what I find is that my subconscious overnight works on that line and is building something before I'm even really consciously aware of it. And if I can get it out in first thing in the morning before my editor wakes up. So I have this my conscious brain I refer to as my editor. And my editor will actually shut everything down because my editor wants a complete, perfect poem to hit the page immediately. So I use my morning writing practice because I'm not a morning person. So if I was a morning person, writing in the morning wouldn't work for me. It works because I'm actually miserable to get up in the morning. If I can get to the computer before that conscious part of my brain that wants everything to be perfect first is awake, then I can get things on the page, and then that conscious part of my brain can start to shape it into something, right? But I have to have something on the page to respond to in order to be able to shape it. So that evening piece and the morning piece, which often produce stuff that I would not show to anybody really, are sort of essential to laying the groundwork for what eventually will become the poem.
Great. No, that's fantastic. I like that. Yeah, I'm a morning person. So as soon as I get up, right now I kind of hobble to the kitchen get the coffee machine going. Yeah. Once I get some caffeine, then I'm usually by 8:30, I'm like, I've already been up for 3 hours. I'm ready for a nap now.
You and my wife like sits right up in bed in the morning and is like wide awake, and we'll have a whole conversation. And I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah. Oh, good. So we know a poem is never finished due to a recent survey we did, but how do you decide something? It's better to say at a stage that it could be in a book, in a collection. How do you know when how does the poem inform you? How do you know when you're at that point?
Sure. Yeah. So my one of my MFA mentors used to say, poems are never finished, only abandoned.
Yeah.
And that sort of stuck with me. But when do you abandon it? When do you say, okay, I'm done, I'm going to stop messing with it? One of the methods that was given to me, which I use a lot, was given to me by a poet named Jim Daniels. And he basically told me to copy out the poem longhand, because I generate my poems through my laptop. I don't write them longhand first. They copy it out longhand. He's like, if you can get to the point where you can write the whole thing and you don't cross anything out and you don't change anything, then you're done.
Yeah.
Or at least done for now.
Yeah, nice.
And that's become a good sort of mechanism for me, because it's hard to get enough distance from your own words to know when they're ready to be shared with the world. Workshopping helps, taking it to other poets and saying, what do you think? But honestly, there will always be somebody who has some opinion. And there will always be something that they think you could tweak. So really being able to center yourself in that, for me, it's that handwriting process. And using that as a mechanism for understanding when something feels like you're done tinkering for now. But honestly, I was at a party once and there was a poet there who had a published book on the shelf of the host. And he went over to that shelf, pulled that book down and started writing, like crossing things out and writing in the margin. The book was published and he still wasn't done. So this is just, it's hard to let something go once you've started working on it.
So is there a time of the day when your handwriting exercise happens, or?
I tend to do that in the afternoons. That's when my editor brain is the most awake and sharp. So I tend to do it when the editor is at his sharpest. And if the editor doesn't mess with it anymore, then I start to send it out.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So please share some of your poetry with us.
Sure, I would love to. So I'm going to be reading to you today from my unpublished chapbook. It is still in the process of trying to find the right publication home. It's called How We Burn, and it uses biblical themes and church documents to explore themes of queerness and belonging. Autobiographically, I came out as an adult in the evangelical church, which was sort of fraught and at times very lonely. And there was a lot of processing in terms of how to create a new sense of self, how to create belonging, where to find that anchor that my faith had been at one point. And so these poems work through a lot of that. And the chapbook starts by sort of recreating the creation myth to make room for some of the experiences and identities that I was grappling with. It's called Fearfully Unmade. In the beginning, God unsaid the dark. He drew in a long breath and unemptied his lungs. And the Spirit of God unfloated while the water swallowed her untroubled. In the beginning, God unmourned the night and unmooned the day. God disconnected water from water, breaking the blue in two. God pulled back the sea from the land as the waves dug clinging fingers in the sand, stumbling grains running distraught back to the ocean. This breaking water, unnamed, unclaimed, but teeming with need. So many mouths full of nothing. No word from mother or the moon as she glowed with ungodly light at the earth split open, torn wide by seed. Here, the beginning of her undoing. Long before God dismembered Adam for Eve, first woman, fearfully unmade, there was this love, unbelievably brutal, for God so loved the world's unending. So you'll hear a lot of biblical themes and imagery throughout the poems that I'll be sharing with you today. And this next one touches on a story from the Old Testament, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which involves the family of a man named Lot. Sodom and Gomorrah is slated for holy demolition in the Old Testament story. It's going to be burned to the ground. And Lot finds special favor with God and is allowed to leave on one condition: nobody can look back. So he and his family are free to leave and not be trapped in the burning town, but they can't look back. They can't look over their shoulder. And Lot's wife is unable to do that. She looks back, and as punishment, she's turned into a pillar of salt. I've always been very intrigued and sort of identified with that character. How hard would it be to walk away from a place that had been your home your whole life and not even look over your shoulder? And that's sort of one of the experiences I had when I was trying to claim my new identity and feeling like I had to walk away from a lot of things that had sort of been foundational for me. And knowing that I had to walk away for my own good. So this is sort of an interweaving of the two stories, my story and the story of Lot's wife. It's called Self-Portrait as Lot's Wife. My home, sweet Sodom, my church, the flames consume each beam, their shelter turned trap of brimstone. I will my eyes forward, an open field laid bare before me. Encrusted fingers, my knuckles white. Without fear, I run my hands over her skin toward the heat of a bush that burns but is not consumed by shame. She is holy ground, but never home. Her love, an impossible miracle. I moan in the morning as I rise, each limb from ash. I pull from the flames the woman I was. The stone of thy will be done, I roll into place, my guard always up, but desire won't stay in the tomb. My vision, a field where snowy cataracts bloom. My mouth, a faulty seam, a saline-stitched hem. Him, my home, my husband, whom burning tears consume. My heart slowly hardens, crystal clear blood pumps through each bone as I turn to run, smoke searing my lungs. I can't breathe, can't go on, can't go back to him. Sweat on my skin, cold and numb. Pillar heavy, I swing my legs away from all I've known. Will my fate be fire or salt? Which death can be healed? And who could will her eyes away from her own tomb? If you're sort of tuned in, that is loosely a form called Villanelle, which is a very repetitive form. There's words that keep coming back, and it's a good container for things that you obsess about. And this was sort of something that I was very obsessed with early on in my coming out process. So it seemed like a good container for that. I'm gonna scroll forward through a few of them. Some of these are much easier to experience on the page than they are out loud. There's one where the word sex is missing and it's just square brackets, and I still haven't figured out how to read that one out loud. So you're gonna have to buy the chapbook if you want to read that poem. But this one is called Lamentation for Leaving the Church. And instead of being a direct interaction with a biblical story or theme, this one came from a little snippet of conversation where someone mentioned that the Lamentations in the Bible are all the same poetic form, or many of them are. But because we, in the United States anyway, tend to read it in English and it's translated, we don't see the form because it would present itself more easily in Hebrew. So many of the Lamentations are in a form called abecedarian, which is a poetic form where every line starts with the next letter of the alphabet, which you can understand why that would be lost in translation, right? Hebrew alphabet is not the English alphabet. So this next poem is an abecedarian as well as a lament. Lamentation for Leaving the Church. All the unborn alleluias, still and silent, the body broken, but bread no longer reaching my mouth. Gold cross hanging empty, its gilded assurance suspended in the dark and necklace. Barely there, another Erica bows her head and waits for a sign. Former self still full of a certain faith. This chest pressed, full of holy ghosts, shaken down for good measure. Shivering hearth that once blazed with tongues, the language of incandescent favor, and angels unbridled, jaw galloping and glorious, head thrown back, wild, keeling wind at my back, before and behind me, hands lifting, so light, every burden no longer mine, my body a temple, a tempter, an atonement. No, nothing, my God, this blood couldn't buy back from the grave. Offer me again sanguine life unending, born again promise, canopied from each limb, the deathbed's posts, queer tree, singing of a sacrificial season, second chances, resurrecting all I've buried. I want to believe in burning stars, wholly invisible in the too bright blue of morning. Teach me to trust the sky, vaulting silence, pierced with unseen light. I push fists in my eyes and they appear vacant. Open this wound where once I buried prayer, Xeno seed tucked deep in this earth, God's son not forgotten. I yearn for another home, a germ of hope, my vining tongue zealous for fruit, its skin, these lips studded with thorns. So as you can see, there's a lot of grappling here. There's a lot of being caught between things, being caught between the things that had brought me comfort in the past and the things that could no longer, and trying to find my way forward to something new. And there were lots of sort of personages that helped me forward in that process. And one of them, oddly, was a woman by the name of Sylvia Earle. If you haven't heard of Sylvia Earle, She was the first human in the 70s to walk in the deepest parts of the ocean. So brand new technologies in the 70s. She had one of those big metal suits, and she walked for the first time in the deepest part of our ocean floor to see what we had no idea was down there. She's older, but still alive now. And I would highly recommend the interview that inspired this poem with the On Being radio show with Krista Tippett. Krista Tippett interviewed her for On Being, which is itself a quasi-spiritual, meaning-making podcast. So she was an interesting character to have on there. But I was just so taken with a lot of what she was saying. And one of the things that she mentioned was that we know so much more about the moon than we do about the ocean. And she sort of tied this to our sort of culturally steeped ideas of hell being below us and heaven being above us. And we're always sort of looking out into space instead of looking down into the earth below us and the seas. So that's where this poem starts. Heaven is above us. And you know what's the other way? She laughed over lunch when you asked why we knew so little of the ocean and so much about the moon. A myth that keeps launching us up and out for answers, but you were the first to brave the beneath. Your bosom locked tight in uncrushable skin, a Jane in your gym, first feet on this floor of our ocean. Tell me how light your womanhood feels under pounds of pressured shadow, submerged in the sea, with its silty flickering, 5% seen, 95% secrets. You walked with small steps for us all through the twinkling, briny twilight. Here, not the hell we've been taught to fear, no monsters with mouths full of queer, needled teeth, nor a barren, soundless rock of a dust-strewn moon. Here, blue fire pulses down giant spiraling coil, stretching their necks to your touch. Fish full of lights, darting through darkness like fireflies in a field full of June. Crabs of all colors clinging to coral, hanging from sea fans like so many shirts on a line. Life tucked in every crevice, floating on invisible currents. Heaven on earth, you called it. Reconceived, immaculate, you released the cord, tying you to the familiar fathoms above. Your feet on holy land, no flag to claim the unknown. And I don't know why I feel like I'm floating as your voice fills the space and time of a long highway drive. But something like prayer bubbles up from my swimming insides. Dear saint of sinking fearless, there are nights when the moon is so new that the earth disappears. In my deep, a frond of want unfurls down where nothing is said to survive. Mother of unearthing, help me untether from all that lies above. Here in the dim, not quite light, my heavy heart is sinking. The book contains poems to various people that sort of inspired me as I moved forward. Sylvia Earle being one. Billy Porter's got a poem in here. Lena Waithe has got a poem in here. I'm going to skip forward a little bit to another poem. Both the Billy Porter poem and the Lena Waithe poem use a form, and I use a lot of forms. I actually heard Mark Doty talking about formal poetry and saying it helps his conscious brain have a task so his subconscious brain can write the poem, which I kind of like and kind of works with what I was talking about as my process. So I gravitate towards form a lot. And that group of poems, the Billy Porter poem, the Lena Waithe poem, and the poem I'm about to read, are all in a fairly modern form called The Golden Shovel. The Golden Shovel was invented by a poet by the name of Terence Hayes. And what he would do is he would take a line from a Gwendolyn Brooks poem, and he would run it one word at a time down the left-hand margin. And then he would write a new poem from the words in the left-hand margin. So it was sort of Gwendolyn Brooks embedded in a new poem. And often the new poem was in conversation with Gwendolyn Brooks. I started doing this with Bible verses and running them down the margins of these poems. So Billy Porter's poem is embedded with a line from Esther. Lena Waithe's poem is embedded with a line from the story of Joshua. This poem is embedded with a verse from 1 Samuel, when Daniel and Nathaniel are parting ways from one another. And the verse reads, "Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most." So that's sort of running down, in my case, the right-hand margin. And then I built the poem towards those end words. This is called Kissin'. Kiss in front of the mirror first. Practice loving lips like yours. Then look for the lips you imagined. Half smile, half question. They tacitly ask, if here, if now, if only in the dark. If we kissed, then how long till we're a we, and which word for what each of us knows we mean. Kiss mean, kiss crying, kiss on the other side of town, kiss on the cheek if there are kids around, kiss and tell without changing pronouns, kiss for who couldn't, who wept or bled or walked perverse, hands cuffed, lips locked together. Keep kissing. Kiss in the street. Kiss on the courthouse steps, but not in the pew. Not even stolen among rainbow stoles. Uncle David, still in your ear, calling your kisses contagion while you wept yourself empty. Kiss the wound. What was buried, kiss back from the dead. Kiss your kids into being. Be the mirror you needed most. I forgot to set a timer, so I'm just going to check in with John real quick. How are we doing?
Yeah, it's 1:35, so I mean, we could go till 2 o'clock. Let me just read a couple of comments here in the chat box before we. So Catherine Petrocelli said, "This is about your Lot series. Beautiful poem, Erica. Beautiful music. I'm also obsessed with Lot's wife. I have Anna Akhmatova's poem on my wall. Yeah, I've read some of her stuff. And then Kathy Senkabah said, I too have identified with Lot's wife. Once tried to write a poem about her looking backward. And then Catherine again, this is about your Sylvia Earle, said, I've only read a children's picture book on Sylvia Earle so far. I feel like your poem also talks to Adrian Rich's diving into the wreck in a way with its commentary on women pioneers.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Wendy is giving you a brilliant rating on your reading so far.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
So, I mean, if you wanted to read 2 or 3 more poems, and some people may have, we like to have a little time for Q&A. You don't have to fill up the whole hour. We're very flexible. So.
Okay, all right. Well, I had one more picked out, and I have a couple more brand new, can't figure out if they're supposed to be in the chat book or not, poems that I could share with you too. This last one that I had picked out, I told you that you would hear a poem today that came from a sign in Yosemite Park, and this is that poem. So my wife and I were traveling in California and seeing a few of the national parks out there. I'm native New Englander, so this was all new to me, and we were exploring it. We pulled off to look at this enormous waterfall in Yosemite. And in walking towards it, you're walking through a meadow, and there was a sign, and it just one of those educational signs that said the difference between a field and a meadow. And I took a picture of it, and you can imagine my wife is just looking at me like, of all the things in Yosemite to take a picture of, I was taking a picture of this sign. And she looks at me, she goes, "Why are you taking a picture of the sign?" And I said, "Because it's a poem. I don't know how it's a poem yet, but it's a poem." And I didn't for several weeks know what even I meant by that. But it's one of those things that I just kind of tucked in the back of my head. And then I was reading Mark Doty's book, My Alexandria. And in there, he has a poem about a meadow. And all of a sudden I went, oh my gosh, I know what the poem is. And this is one of the few poems that I've ever written that came out almost whole hog. I've done very little to it since it first came out on the page. So one, you'll hear a reference that says, the Gospel of Mark says, and it seems like it's biblical because so much of the rest of what I've read to you today is biblical, but it's the Gospel of Mark is actually Mark Doty in this case. All right, so this is the difference between a field and a meadow. The difference between a field and a meadow, the sign tells us, is diversity. No suburban rows of plant development here. Not the same shapes stretching in perpendicular regularity from my eye as we drove hundreds of miles past fields of almond and apricot, exactingly spaced, endless lines of precise grapevines, and the pumpjacks nodding heavy heads in time through California's hypnotic Central Valley until we arrived at our home for a night. Our unknown host welcomed from every wall and pillow with nearly identical Christian sentiments, cultivated and displayed in regular rows. God is love. You are loved. The embroidery says, consider the lilies of the field. And I do, deciding he must have meant meadow, unless he was walking amidst a greenhouse with blooms grown only to be cut, and Jesus was making some point about high margin yields and pragmatic hands more than the miracle of meadow. Below Yosemite's cliffs, at the foot of its highest waterfall, we stand by a stretch of green that when passed at 25 miles an hour just looks like grass. To my suburban eyes, a chore. But to others, these blades are food, shelter, or baskets. Deer grass being what the Awanichi tribes prized for their weaving. Their preference to tend not by plows, but by fire. The same flames we're told sequoias need to open their cones, the seeds only unlocked by tongues that hollow their hulking trunks with burns so large I could stand inside without bowing my head. I bent my forehead to bark and said, thank you, though I don't speak the electric tongue of trees whose roots we know now are not dumb, but abuzz with warning or comfort or the gospel of rain. No sign of clouds in the sky today, or maybe there's a message I miss as I read that not many places have the right mix of soil, frequency of fire, and water to cultivate what to us seems wild. The grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, and he must have meant me, the unnameable blades that have thrived in the life I burned to the ground. Fire held fast in my shaking hand, hesitant, while chiding gospel scold, oh, of you of little faith. How many ways can a life rise from its ashes, I wonder? And the words of Mark affirm, a meadow accepts itself as various. I look to the sky for a sign, some cloud in the shape of a need I cannot name. I test the wind with my tongue as a torch song burns my lips, smoke filling my chest with a longing to bow to the ground. So that's all I had picked, but maybe let me grab one more here.
Yeah, grab one more, and then Wendy will, or I can. We always like to hear some comments, Q&A besides what's in the chat box.
Sure. Yeah. I've been working on a series of poems that are all rewrites of the Lord's Prayer in different ways.
Interesting.
Using that as the form. And I started out with one, and now I've got 8. And it's just become this whole series. So I'll read you a few of those, just a couple. One of them came actually from a workshop that I did with Jericho Brown. He's a poet who, if you're not familiar, you should go and read some of his work right now. Never mind me, go find him, because his work is incredible. But he led a workshop with some college students that I had the privilege of dropping in on, where he took a small poem and he asked them to word by word go through the poem and write the opposite word. And in some cases, that's really easy, right? Is becomes is not, right? In other cases, it's really hard to figure out what the opposite of a word is. What's the opposite of the word gun? What is the opposite of a gun? It's a very philosophical question all of a sudden. And so he had them go through this process. And they all came up with very different sets of opposite words. And then he's like, use your meaning making brain, because we've all got these meaning makers in there. He says, use your meaning making brain and come up with the poem from those words, using them in that order as much as you can. And it was a really interesting exercise and brought out a lot of very interesting poems that probably wouldn't have come from just sitting down to write that poem. So I tried it out with the Lord's Prayer. And what I ended up with was this poem. And all the poems in this series are entitled, When You Pray, Pray Like This. When you pray, pray like this. Our Mother, immaculate and manifest in every curve, the curse is not your name. Extinct be your anonymity, your ruin depart, your instinct to disappear be undone until the sky is no longer an eye. Watch as I raise myself from this grave. Take from me this night my mortared stone, but maintain with me my boundaries. I am nothing like accountable for that which stays within me, nor that which strays without me, following my pulse outside of repulsion. Receive every me with generosity against any aching that isn't anarchy, and draw me into your shameless rest against every never except the one I am becoming. And I'll read you another version, which started out with me thinking about how a lot of my journey had to do with me learning to trust my body and to trust myself. And so I decided I wanted to write a version of the prayer that honored that relationship between me and my body. So we'll make this the last one, but this is another in that series. When you pray, pray like this. My body, which cradles this cranium, humming be the bone. My craving come, my gut be followed on foot as well as flat on my back. Circulate this day my circadian cells and discharge my toxic as I excrete those who intoxicate me, and lead me not into numbness, but marrow me from viral. For mine is this failing frame, its whir and its thump, forever and ever, or until my heart's last. Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much. I would, if you have questions, I would love to do a little Q&A.
Well, I applaud your discipline to engage different forms. Once again, I've written a few things, but the forms side of the world is a little new to me. But no, I think it's great that you've experimented with different styles, and I'm applauding your willingness to take a plunge, take a deep dive into the ocean. So,
thank you. Thank you.
Erica, I am just really moved by your work, and your talent is astounding. And the way you approach these themes, kind of, my perception is like you approach them from the Bible, and then it's really fascinating and beautiful. And I also, like John, I'm fascinated by the idea of the form. And, I want to go to this workshop where someone takes a poem and says, everybody in the room, write the opposite word, and then just see what comes out of that. It's such a brilliant idea.
Yes. Yeah. No, I am tucking it away for a class that oftentimes I facilitate bringing poets into classrooms. But for mass poetry, I also serve as the emergency backup poet. So if ever my friends have dubbed me the emergency backup poet for life. But basically, if anything happens to the poet the day that they're supposed to go teach, I jump in and I make sure that the workshop happens. And so I'm always sort of squirreling away workshop ideas. I haven't pulled that one out yet, but I want to. Because it's so fascinating when you think of opposites as such a simple thing. But it really is very fertile ground for taking you into different territory. Often, if you write enough poetry, you start to write the same poem over and over and over again. And so I think all poets, but certainly myself, I'm constantly looking for ways to push me out into something else, into some other way of approaching what I'm trying to write about. And sometimes that's through a different biblical lens. Sometimes that's through Sometimes that's through current events. Actually, Billy Porter and Lena Waithe, those poems were in response to things that had happened in the news that I sort of tucked away, and then much later ended up working into the poem. One was Billy Porter going to the Emmys in his beautiful gown. So he became Esther. So that was one way that sort of knocked me into a different sort of way of viewing things. Lena Waithe went to the Met Gala that was all Catholic regalia themed, with this beautiful Pope's cape that was the rainbow flag. And I immediately saw that and thought of the Technicolor Dreamcoat. And so that began working. So it's lots of different methods for sort of knocking ourselves a little sideways from the way we always tell the story to find something new in the stories that we have to tell. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things I think I like about form too, honestly. When there's a constraint, it sort of forces me to not go to the first word I think of, but to push a little further and find another word. So you're doing that abecedarian. I had to start the next line with a B word, even if that wasn't my first instinct. And by doing that, it sort of pushed me into new territory, so that the poem itself starts to be a way of exploring for me, and a teacher of a kind. I like to let the poem tell me what it needs to say, which sounds much more mystical than it actually is. It's more, I think, just leaving the poem room without my ego imposing on it to form in sort of its own way.
It's funny, when you said emergency poet, immediately came to mind those old fireboxes with the glass, break glass, pull down lever. And then obviously now, after the pull down lever, a poet just pops up out of the firebox. And I just thought to myself, I've never heard of that.
There should be one in every home, John. There should be one in every home.
Absolutely.
Wendy, we need to start having emergency poets.
I love that idea.
We're missing a key element of the creative process. No, I love it. Listen,
great.
No, the forms, the emergency poet. Listen, every week. I mean, there's just so much new that lets us explore, the creative, poetic process. So it's really great. As you can tell, I get pretty charged up by the end of the hour, because because I'm not used to these forms. And the emergency poet thing, I'm going to be, going on that for a few days. Wendy's probably going to hear it like 7 times before the end of the week from me.
Just don't encase them in glass. Just
don't enclose them in glass. Yeah. Yeah.
No fish tanks.
In a different container.
Yeah, they need some air. You don't want to suffocate the poet.
Well, I would like to offer the opportunity for people to ask any questions they may have, or any commentary you might wish to add before we close.
No, we have 3 quiet Hollywood squares.
Quiet house here. There is gratitude in the chat box. And I'd like to reiterate that gratitude. Erica, thank you so much for sharing the beautiful way you work with language. It's been a real treat.
Yeah. My absolute pleasure.
Yeah, no, very good.
So perhaps we'll see some of you next week for another poetry reading. And Erica and John, my gratitude to both of you. And I wish everyone a lovely afternoon.
Yeah, great. Thanks again, Erica.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.